here every week on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. I'm Kelii Akina, president of the Grassroot Institute. Once in a while I get to do something that's just purely fun, and that's talk to a great thinker. And today we've got one with us because not only is his profession one that promotes thinking, he himself comes from a truly global and integrative perspective on the world, and he's come here to Hawaii. His name is Martin Despang. He's a German architect who is a professor of architecture at the University of Hawaii. What I thought we'd do today is simply kick back and have a conversation between a philosopher, myself, and an architect, and invite you into this conversation as we look at some of the problems or some of the nature of reality here in the state of Hawaii and see whether there are different ways to think about it. Martin, aloha, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me back, Keli'i. It's an honor and pleasure to be on your show, which I always appreciated collegially because I used to have one as well.
That's right.
You're
very familiar with ThinkTech Hawaii, and I welcome you back. And you know, I just want you to know how much I've been looking forward simply to having a conversation with you, one in which we're not just talking about what time of the day it is or where to get the least traffic, but really exploring things. How long have you been here in Hawaii?
3 years now.
3 years. And you grew up in Germany. Where in Germany was that?
I grew up as a child of an urban fabric in Hanover, Germany. Now we have, my sister runs our Munich office and my father our Dresden office. So we're in Ohana, architectural Ohana.
How about that? Your whole family, architects.
Yeah. But I moved on to the American Midwest in Nebraska. I can say that well still.
Very good. Well done.
And thought that was my home away from home. And I thought even I need to grow up and move on. So I tried to get a taste of another climate zone, culturally very different. That was the hot, arid climate of the Southwest desert in Tucson, Arizona. And finally, I have arrived in paradise.
Here you are, paradise, that's right. Now, paradise, we often hear, has a dark side to it as well, because as much as we have this beautiful weather and the beautiful people and the coming together of so many individuals from across the world, we've got an economy that's not exactly what we want it to be. We've got cost of living that's not exactly what we want it to be. We have people living outdoors without anywhere to go or put their things. It seems that paradise has a bunch of what people call problems. And I know you and I were recently talking about that word problems because it sometimes puts situations into a narrow frame of reference in which we're trying to solve one issue but not others.
I really appreciate, as you know, your ability and your will to critically think, and not hide things. So I mean, and that's a core one. Thank you. That's a core one we obviously have. So as we said, mostly we consider us already in an elevated way to be problem solvers, but that sometimes reduces it to just the mechanics of it. So of course we don't necessarily always have to create problems because we have enough problems already, but we should address the problems and we should look at them from different angles.
When somebody uses the word problem, they're almost always speaking from a frame of reference. For example, if you are a store owner and you have whom we call the homeless sleeping outside on your sidewalk, your problem is how do we move the homeless? And when we approach a situation like those without roofs over their head, simply by saying they're a problem for somebody who is trying to do a business, and they may be, we narrow the whole approach to that.
Yeah. And I can say, as far as it gets to the subject of expertise, right, and of specialization, as far as the homeless, we're all experts because we see them. And I engage with them because I'm still the child of the urban, I am, so I live in Waikiki. So I meet them, I see them on a daily basis. And I look at them, I try not to actually sentimentalize things, which I would love to, because many who I appreciate a lot, including my former co-host Aniandra Yamashita and her mother Ann, they call me an idealist, and I take it as a compliment. But we know how it is with idealism, in a real world, you get to your limits, right?
That's right.
Soon. So I try not to, but I'm still, when I go to work on my bicycle, I look at them and I'm kind of impressed by their ingenuity of, it's on Kapahulu, it's on the Diamond Head side of the golf course. This is where they get swept out all the time and they always come back. And they find their shelters in the most clever way. You know, they use existing structures, they use trees, they use fences, and they just do the necessary. They don't do more, you know, they're not wasteful. And again, I'm not trying to romanticize and saying, you know, they have the greatest life, but what I'm trying to say is they make the best of it.
Well, what you're also suggesting is that when we change the context and no longer regard them as the problem that I have interfering with the goals that I have from this frame of reference, we begin to see that they have assets, that they have gifts, that they are not liabilities.
And that's so true, you know, if you like come from another continent culture where now it's winter in temperate climates. 60% of the world climates are temperate. It's really getting cold into the freeze. And so they come here and they don't have to wear anything, right? And then they see basically people, where most of these people come from, you cannot live on the streets because you freeze to death, or in the desert you get a heat stroke. So here actually you have the possibility, which is also one of the reasons why, well, there are more reasons than one. There's the local problem, and then there's also sort of a more global problem that some of them feel attracted by that. So if you could sort of cultivate that you don't need much, you know, if we solve the necessities that we have, which is basically access to water, both as waste and both as fresh water. Just on my way jogging this morning, Diamond Head Road, there's this hose on the outlook where the surface go down, and there was a homeless woman basically loading up on water. And it reminded me of the indigenous where they went to the well, right? And they got their water. So why, you know, to some degrees, and actually I have to say, some years ago, I was still in Nebraska on a busy street, and the first time it really occurred to me that it's a question of mindset, of perspective, is there was an older lady on a walking aid, and she was on the side of the road, which wasn't pleasant to walk because there were all these cars. And she was walking her groceries. And up to that point, I was like everyone else who was thinking, oh, what a poor lady, you know, she has to walk. This was the moment where it clicked, and I thought, she's actually elevated. She's our role model, or she should be, because she's not using fossil fuel. She's not creating obesity for herself.
She doesn't have much of a carbon footprint and so forth.
Exactly, she is doing that. And that's exactly what you're talking about, is the angle of thinking.
There's some people who consider that a luxurious way of living. Now, in line with seeing what we usually don't see, in line with getting out of the very narrow frame of reference that this is a problem because of this goal that it impedes. You have a wonderful word in your home language in German that translates into homelessness roughly, but what is that word?
The Obdachlosigkeit, yes.
Say it nice and slowly so we hear each syllable.
Obdachlosigkeit.
Now tell me, what does each syllable mean?
So every German language is tough, everyone knows
That's right, like Farfignugan.
Exactly, which actually doesn't really exist. That was created by
Haagen-Dazs.
Exactly, you got that right. It's all about branding, right? Cultural branding. But Obdachlosigkeit, the Losigkeit is basically less, you know.
Okay, less.
Yeah, that's at the end. And the core part is the most interesting. That means roof.
Roof.
And the up in front of that, there's no other word that I can think of in my language that has that connotation to another word. But it's sort of, when I think about it, it elevates it above the mere meaning of that core word, which is roof.
All right.
So there's something implied that is more like physical shelter. So there might be home implied, but it's not said.
So some kind of existence that is roofless, some kind of existential state that is roofless, which totally changes the notion of homelessness, because rooflessness could be a terrible thing. You have no structures to protect you from the elements and so forth. Or it could be a wonderful thing on a starry night.
Exactly.
And indeed, having a lot of space in which to live may not be the only way to have fulfillment. You yourself, you're educated, you're a professional, you have a professorship at a university, so you have some financial means. Don't you live in a tiny place? How much square footage do you have?
It's 230 square feet.
230 square feet?
I think it is too much. It's way too much. Because it takes me like 2 hours to clean. By the way, part of that is my lanai, which I appreciate. But my lanai needs to be swept twice a week because
so you've got a problem. The 236 square feet means you've got to do more cleaning than you want to do. There are people who want closets bigger than 236 square feet.
And that's the other thing, that my closet is limited to 2 feet width, because it's basically a hotel room that's rented out as a studio. So the physical limitations kind of prevent me from becoming a victim. It's the physical and also the mental, of course, going along, and there's reciprocity between the two, right? So we talk about, this is a new trend in living. And again, we should be cautious. Whenever something becomes the big idea that's branded by the media,
it becomes commoditized.
Exactly. We reduce it to just one aspect of it.
But what we're discovering here is that what constitutes a problem is quite relative. It's relative to one's goals. It's relative to one's relationship to society and so forth. And so when we look at homelessness as a single problem, we end up treating it as somebody else's problem. They're in the way, or they need welfare payments, or they need to conform to what we want in society. Martin, you're familiar with the French word problématique. What does that imply? That our issue is not about a single problem, but what does a problématique imply?
Well, it is that more comprehensive view of things, all-encompassing, bringing all the things together. And you're so right. I mean, if we go to the next extreme, we would say, well, maybe we consider to be normal ones who have that home, which means we got to pay rent, or a mortgage, we got to pay utilities, we got to pay maintenance fees, we got to pay all that. So actually, we all have to work all day inside. It doesn't matter if we're in Hawaii anymore. So, and again, once again, I'm very sort of self-aware of not trying to over-romanticize things, but when sometimes I walk down to the beach at Diamond Head where the lighthouse is, and I walked down there, I took my shoes off, and I only got like 10 feet, and then I cut my foot, and I was bleeding like a pig, and homeless came and rescued me. They had nothing, but they had the biggest Band-Aid because they were prepared for disaster, for my disaster. And one of them was the tier that they don't have a home, but they have a shelter, which is a car, and so he drove me home. And I was like spontaneously, thanking him by having him have a shower and fix a quick breakfast. And further along, there's one who basically uses a slot where police doesn't chase him away because no one is complaining about him, because he's not in front of the McMansion, he's not in front of a park, he nestles in the trees, he puts a tarp that protects him against rain, and he can actually hear the sound of the ocean. We're talking about the stars as one beautiful thing, but when I sleep, I actually don't want to sleep my prime time when there are close to no cars between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. because that's when I theoretically and even practically can hear the ocean because I'm so close. Everything after that, not so much paradise anymore, because again, once again, it's a question of paradigm and paradigm shift.
So when it comes down to it, we need a new way of looking at things that we've looked at very narrowly. Instead of seeing things as a problem per se, we need to realize that there are multiple problems that come from multiple frames of reference, a problematique. You and I have something in common. We were both admirers of R. Buckminster Fuller. And when I was a boy, I just loved the geodesic dome that was right there at the entrance to the Hilton Hawaiian Village. Went there many times. I was just awestruck when I would go inside of it. It felt like being inside of a planetarium or out at night and so forth. Buckminster Fuller talked a lot about systems, about synergistic thinking. What is that?
And once again, unfortunately, that term system, which I'm dealing a lot with in school, has so much been hijacked and bastardized by technocracy.
But it has a lot to do with looking inclusively.
Originally, and that's what he was. And you did your homework here about Bucky here, which I appreciate.
I have a little geodesic model over here we can take a look at.
And I did too, and I found out while doing research the last couple of days, ever since we both talked about it, that actually the inclusiveness, the dome is actually so different to today, where now Howard Hughes is getting architects on board to design glamorous towers. So we get Richard Meyer, who's probably considered to be one of the most famous American architects. Bucky wasn't like that. He wasn't about himself. In fact, the dome wasn't even done by him. It was done by one of his fellows, Don Richter, probably some German background there. And so it was creating the think tank the pool of ideas, and then he was happy and actually intended to share that, spread the idea. So it wasn't about this sort of isolated object, right?
Well, we're going to take a break, Martin, and when we come back, let's talk a little bit about revisioning paradise.
Thank you. Yeah,
Seeing
look forward to
paradise
it.
from a more systems point of view and a correct understanding of the term system. So I think that this has been fascinating, just chatting with Martin Despang, an architect whose thinking goes well beyond little boxes. And when we return to Ehana Kako, we'll talk a little bit more about what we can benefit from in terms of systems thinking here in the state of Hawaii. You're watching the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. We'll be right back.
Aloha, my name is Jim Sean, and I'm host of a show called Education Movers, Shakers, and Reformers. Each week, live streaming at noon on ThinkTech Hawaii, we interview people who have special insights into education, from early education through K-12, all the way through higher education and beyond. Both public and private are areas we're interested in. We dig deeper. We try to find out what it's really like to be involved in making change, advocating for it, how you reform, what people's philosophies are in reforming it. As I said, we're live streaming every Wednesday at noon on ThinkTech Hawaii. And later on, you can find these interviews on YouTube and on the Hawaii Educational Policy Center website. We hope you join us as many times as possible. Aloha.
Welcome back to Ehana Kako. We're here every week on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. We broadcast at 2 o'clock p.m. on Mondays. But you can see all of the content that is produced by ThinkTech Hawaii hosts on thinktechhawaii.com, about 30 to 35 hours every week. I take my hat off to Jay Fidel, the producer, and all of the volunteers and great staff of ThinkTech Hawaii. My guest today is Martin Despang, an architect, and we're having a bit of a philosophical conversation. In the first segment, we talked about the fact that very often problems are seen in isolation. In fact, we call them problems, and problems are things that we want to get rid of. So when we see homelessness, as we were talking about, as a problem, it's invariably somebody else's problem. Maybe they're in your way on the sidewalk that you like to walk on, or whatever else it may be. But if we broaden the concept, and instead of seeing one thing merely as an isolated problem, but perhaps the opportunity for multiple solutions, we start asking what kinds of problems can we solve, and see how integrated and how broad society and reality are. And Martin is well skilled at thinking along those lines, both in terms of your architectural work and just your philosophical work. Martin, you apply all of this to a concept called Rethinking Paradise. Well, even before I begin, why would anyone want to rethink paradise?
Well, one of the first shows we ever did, Aleandri and myself, was having Don Hibbert, who I call the legacy, the collective brain memory of our islands. And he wrote a book that was called Designing Paradise. And it's about the beginning of resort architecture, which basically, and that traces us back actually to the dome we're talking about, the kind of the, has different names, but one of them is the Kaiser Dome.
Yes.
So Kaiser was also an interesting person who actually brought tourism to the islands.
Henry J. Kaiser.
And until then, you know, the labor on the island was highly relying on sort of agriculture, and there was a lot of unemployment because it was not predictable and it wasn't consistent all the time. So Kaiser came late in his life, in his early 70s, came and brought this idea to the island, say tourism is the thing to go.
Along with the concrete industry.
Yeah, exactly, Hawaiian dredging, and this is how it all started. Hawaii Kai is a result of that. And the Kaiser Dome is one of them. And I think, you know, all these developments in these times, they were driven, like everything in America in mid-century, and I'm speaking also on behalf of being a board member of Doko Momo, that treasures the legacy of the mid-century, was culturally driven. And it had to have commercial viability, but it was driven by culture. And all these examples, the Kaiser Dome, for example, was many things. It was an icon. So first of all, it was out there and everyone saw it. So it had an aesthetical appeal. But then it was like nature, because Bucky was about optimization of systems.
Buckminster Fuller, yes.
Buckminster Fuller, nicknamed Bucky, exactly.
That's right. And that was optimization, not maximization.
No, it wasn't.
What was best, not necessarily what was biggest.
Exactly. So it was like the dome, the detail is interesting. That was one of the first domes that was built after his geodesic dome ideas, Buckminster Fuller's. And Kaiser wanted to see it being built, but he missed it because his flight was late and it only took 20 hours to build the thing. That's genius, right? I mean, this is optimization we're talking about. But last, not at least, it became an environment for poetry, for artistic articulation. You're right, I looked it up, Don Ho was playing there. And the Exotica movement, one of them, Arthur Lehman, they recorded their music, and you can go online, still have people who memorized that awesome acoustics. They were waiting until the traffic was gone on Kalakaua, and then they recorded, which also talks about. So all the systems, so to speak, were integrated into that very simple but almost cosmic creation.
If anybody has tuned in late, Martin is talking about a wonderful place that used to exist at the entrance to the Hilton Hawaiian Village. And indeed, Don Ho did perform there. Everybody knows that. I performed there, but nobody remembers that. I was a chanter, and we did Hawaiian presentations and so forth. And there was no finer acoustical environment, whether you were acoustical or whether you were electronic. It was wonderful. So you began to answer the question why we would want to rethink Paradise by talking about all the heavy-duty thinking that actually went into designing Paradise. It's almost as if we're so intent on building something that took a life of its own that we now have to somewhat deconstruct it.
Yeah. And I think, you know, when the audience looks at the background picture there, right?
Yes.
If you choose to be the one, which is where we are right now, this is downtown. You know, many people in the world might actually think this is LA. If they're not experts in specific buildings, they might think it's San Francisco. They might think it's Boston. So what's specific about Hawaii in that fabric? And that's what actually I call my students the emerging generation. And I totally believe that's why I'm into teaching. They will make the change happen. They will rethink. But first, they need to address the problems before they can solve it, as we talked and agreed. So I ran a studio about a year ago. And in about mid-January, on behalf of the invitation of the American Institutes of Architects, there will be an artifact of that studio will be displayed in the storefront just down the road, 4th Street Mall.
Right, the building across the street from where you and I are sitting at this moment. And it's going to display one of your works, or your students' collaborative works.
The emerging architects' work, under my tutorship. And what it started that we went on Kohio Avenue, and the goal was to assess, with all these senses, what is paradise? What is still paradise about it? And the students, like said, well, it's pretty loud, all the buses and the cars. They make it, that and other reasons make it smell really bad. It's pretty hot because everything is concealed and the concrete reflects. They came up with a conclusion, nothing is paradise anymore. So why would people come with a perception of Hawaii as paradise and end up in a concrete jungle, basically?
So it's almost what Milton penned, Paradise Lost.
Exactly. And then I took them out, and that was before the sharks got more interested in us more recently. I was a little safer because I took them out where I swim every morning, which is Queens Beach. And I swim as far out as I can, and I'm courageous to do. I shut off my swimming engines, and I float in the water, and I look at the backdrop of the Green Mountains, and I see the Gray Mountains, and I have this vision of converting the gray into an equally organic, and that's once again not single-mindedly thought, not literally, organic or green, but an all-encompassing, self-sustained kind of organism.
Well, that's incredible. So the rethinking in part has to be done because the direction we've gone may not be ideal, and the rethinking needs to take into consideration recapturing the paradise that is actually here. So I would imagine that would result in a totally different kind of architecture. I know that some of the architecture from the period you described, the concrete jungle, as it were, created lots of big boxes that shut out nature.
Exactly.
And they were harsh and they were heavy and so forth. I would imagine your architecture that emerges from rediscovering and rethinking paradise would want to incorporate much more of the sky, the ocean, the breeze, the light, and so forth.
Thank you. Perfectly said. It's almost nothing to add from my side. I love it.
But I'm not even an architect.
No, well,
but I do know this, that we all together have some sense of what paradise
Exactly.
is. And so why is it that we have boarded up and closed off paradise?
Yeah. I think it has to do with invasiveness. Because invasive, and then I want to get to, because we want to have a positive message. The positive would be exotic, the definition of exotic, which I learned from my dear colleagues at the Department of Tropical Plants and Soil Science, Thomas Lim, who was a guest of ours in Urban Transcendence, and then Brian Terreno. So invasive, we all know, is something that comes, takes over, pushes the local out. And the exotic is also not from here. It comes from somewhere else, but it complements an environment. And ever since your great speech at our friend Howard Wick's party just last weekend, you made this wonderful observation and shared with the audience that you say Hawaiian culture has always been inclusive. It has been welcoming influences as long as they were positive, and that's what basically exotic is. So what we could oversimplified say, what we did wrong was basically bringing the combustion engine to the island, which led to air condition and to cars. And if we, because we didn't need them before that, so there must have been a way, and there was a way, and you already beautifully described how that worked. So why not going back to that? But be careful not to go back, and the Mene would say to the cave, or he would say to the beach, because that would turn people off. You sure want to find a blend of the vernacular principles that should still work, and embracing modern technology that we have come up with that we could basically combine. So that vision of rethinking paradise, we took the island of Waikiki, which it was intended to be, that just didn't complete the last arm of water on Kapahulu, but it's basically pretty much that isolated urban fabric. And if you take off, the major problem is the wall architecture part. The invasiveness comes from the International Building Code that we have adopted, and that's why we're so proud of Howard, who wants to bring it back, an appendix, make it a tropical code, so we don't build to a climate that's not ours, that we have adopted and we made a mistake. So that's one change. And Howard allows us then to go more easy breezy. So you basically let the trades winds blow through, and you find some mitigation that we could be very creative, could be even locally produced, that you have shoji screens, other membranes that you basically block yourself a little bit from the elements. That's why the people who go to the exhibit will see that the students built the model, the buildings, not as blocks as you see in reality in the background here, but the floor slabs. So it's like a stacked lanai kind of system. And the next step is basically the one to take the traffic out. And that sounds like very provocative. However, most European cities and many American cities have done that. And the business people have only been upset for a few days, because then they understood that people who walk shop, as opposed to some who drive and try to desperately find parking, they don't shop. So it's very easy. So it's actually not sort of a conflict of interest between ecology and economy. There could be a synergy in that.
What happens in some of the things you're talking about is processes such as the wind, or the sun, or the stars at night coming in through the roof, and so forth. Processes that have been called problems that we have to get rid of can now become assets.
I love you saying that.
And just as we may think of some of these processes as liabilities, they can be transformed. We think of the homeless as liabilities. Therefore, they are something to get rid of, rather than to think of having a place within a more integrated system. Somebody whom you know also was fond of R. Buckminster Fuller is Fritjof Capra, the Austrian astrophysicist who wrote the book, The Tao of Physics, and then later on, The Turning Point. And one of the stories he tells, it's not original, I'm sure it's a Zen koan or something like that, but one of the things he points out is that we tend to regard things in terms of very narrow definitions. We plow down forests and we deforest vast regions because we see a commodity called wood that can be shipped out as a product, as a building export. But if we reconceived of trees as systems of life, we would see something different. Rather than see a tree, we would see a shelter for animals. We'd see shade for birds. We'd see a factory for oxygen. We'd see so much more integration of the sky down through the earth. And what would happen then is we'd have a different set of problems. You and I earlier spoke about the word problematique, that our real problem is we narrow down something to being one problem rather than realizing problems are opportunities to solve, but we have to find multiple problems to solve. So now instead of thinking, how do I keep the elements out, maybe our new problem is how can we bring them in a meaningful way that can harness energy as well as can create levels of enjoyment.
And we probably surprised Sachi here because she was saying we're so different in some ways. So she was excited to see how we would get along.
On that note, perhaps Sachi, who's one of our technical people today, is trying to tell us something, which is it's time for a break. So Martin and I will be back, done with our philosophizing for at least the next 60 seconds, and we encourage you to return. Martin Despang, an architect from Germany who has wonderful ideas, and I just enjoy the opportunity to take a break today and talk with him about rethinking paradise. We'll be right back on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network after this.
Hi, I'm Jay
How do we do
Fidel.
it?
I'm host of Hawaii, the State of Clean Energy, which is our flagship show, which plays 4 to 5 p.m. every Wednesday. And the supporters of that show are Hawaii Energy Policy Forum and Hawaii Energy. And luckily enough, we have representatives of both of them right here today to tell you more about what they think about the show. Sharon Moriwaki at my left is co-chair of Hawaii Energy Policy Forum, and she goes first. Sharon?
Thank you. Thank you, Jay. I'm so glad that we have this Hawaii, the State of Clean Energy. This was 2 years ago when we started this, and we have continued it because it's so important, and there's so many developments happening across the state. And we hope you'll tune in every Wednesday, 4 to 5. It's wonderful.
And Ray is Hawaii Energy. Ray, what is your thought about the same subject?
Well, I agree completely with Sharon that we are talking about every Wednesday, 4 to 5. We talk about some of the most important subjects that are affecting the islands now and into the future. Energy, clean energy, we need it. We often run into new ideas that we had not thought about before. We did just today, and I think we're going to have more of that in the future. So come on down and watch us 4 to 5 on Wednesdays, and we'll see what happens.
We'll see you then. Aloha.
Aloha.
We're back for our final segment today of Ehana Kako on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. I'm Kelii Akina with the Grassroot Institute, and at the Grassroot Institute, we love to use a venerable old Hawaiian saying, e pule kako, let's pray together, and we've transformed it into a hana kako, which means let's work together. Can you imagine the terrible alternative if we don't work together? So we invite you through the Grassroot Institute to work for a better government, better economy, better society. And we're talking a little bit about that today with Martin Despang, my friend and German architect, who understands that things are not what always meets the eye. We have to re-envision, we have to rethink, we have to reconceive. And we've been talking about that. New problems, rather than just one problem. Maybe what we need is more problems so we can seek more solutions. And every problem is an opportunity to a solution. What in your thinking here in Hawaii, as advice to our policymakers, as advice to our voters, body politic, what in your thinking might be a starting point where we as a people can begin to take practical steps, a practical step perhaps, to rethink paradise?
I can easily connect where we where we stopped before the break. One of my former mentees and emerging colleagues, he's from Brazil, and that's Felipe. Hi, Felipe. And Felipe told me the story that when I was telling him about that vision of basically making the urban fabric easy breezy, take the glass off, which makes it a microwave, right? Let the trade winds, which is the most free, talking cost,
right.
the most healthy air conditioning that no one else in the world has, so we might as well use it because everyone would love to have it, so we have it, so we should use it. And then we basically sort of make the city walkable. And then he said, where he comes from in Brazil, the mayor of the town faced the same problem that, you know, the general people didn't want to take a risk. So he basically said, okay, I'm the one who runs the show. I take my city workers and I take the risk to make them block the streets, and from the next day on, it's going to be walkable.
Well, let me ask you a question to apply some of what you talked about. You talk about the free, natural air conditioning we have over here. Here's a public policy problem. We have a centrally controlled, statewide school system. And one office basically controls the architecture or the development of the physical plants in schools on all of the islands. As it turns out, many of these schools did not build air conditioning into the units that are used for classrooms. Not only that, those classrooms are of such a design that over the last year we've been noting temperatures of 115 degrees in some of these classrooms. We've sent students to the hospital because of it. Now, we've got legislators scurrying about trying to find money to put air conditioning units into these schools and so forth. Just a simple question to you as an architect. Couldn't we have just designed these boxes better so that they wouldn't have even required any units altogether of air conditioners?
Absolutely. I mean, that's...
Is that, I mean, truly, or is that idealistic?
One of the shows we had, the Urban Transcendence, was with Kenneth Meston, who works for the Department of Education. And we had actually a very great philosophical discussion as well about the things. But you're right, and we used to build schools like that, so better, we should be able to do it again. What happened in the meanwhile, another analogy, because analogies always help because they make things more transparent, is like we have been building buildings here, and that's school and, you know, dwellings, as if we would wear a winter coat here in Hawaii. Then you overheat. So then you wear a hat.
Right.
The hat has to have a windmill and photovoltaics, which is already progressive, sort of.
So the codes we used to...
And that one runs a fan that drags out the heat under your winter coat. You could do that, and maybe some industries are happy, the coat industry and the hat industry, right? They all benefit, but does it make sense? No, it doesn't make sense. It makes sense to wear your Hawaiian shirt that's easy breezy, that does the job.
How about that?
And it's as simple as that, or it could be, should be.
So the very architecture we have used is solving the wrong problem. At the wrong place, at the wrong time.
It is.
It goes back to what you and I were talking about in having a narrow problem rather than seeing the real problems that we need to solve.
And reconnecting to that vision of Rethinking Paradise. So when you have taken out the traffic out of the core, which in that Brazil case worked. And by the way, what I wanted to say is then this mayor who has been so brave to take the risk, the personal risk to do that overnight, he's now celebrated as one of the raw models of urban sustainability, right? Sometimes it takes some courage. That's what I try to say with that. So think about then the potential you create, because the cars don't need to be hosted in buildings anymore. So you free up the space, potentially, and these spaces, the cars are actually being treated better than the dwellings, because the dwellings are walled off, but the cars have not. So the cars have been sheltered easy breezy. We call this parking garages, open parking garages. So you free up space that you can use for functions that a building needs to be more self-sustained. That could be urban agriculture. And the farmers of the new urban agricultures could be the one who have formerly been without a home, and we call them homeless. They could become the new urban farmers. They would be reintegrated, and they would be the proud stewards of food security in the new rejuvenated city.
Since we're talking about solutions now, in other words, putting the rubber to the road, although we want less rubber on and less roads rolled together. Let's go full circle, come full circle, and talk about homelessness again, which we began talking about at quite a lofty philosophical level. And now, what would be some practical solutions for Hawaii's urgent need for housing for people? And I'm not just talking about the homeless. I'm talking about those who are barely making it check to check to pay rent or mortgage.
And wonderful you bring this up, because my banker at my university bank is in that range, and she basically came up with this too good to be true solution that reconnects us magically now. There's this really great meandering thread going through this session here to schools. And she says, and she's a wonderful person, but we would probably call her, a simple workforce, member. And she comes up with the idea, and she said, why children go to school during the day and then they go home. Homeless are usually out and about over the day, and they need a place basically at night. We can call this timeshare, right?
There
in an
you go.
innovative way. And then we got to tell both parties that they rely on each other. So the homeless need to know that they become the stewards of the schools at night. They could replace the security, and they can basically take care. And as an effect on the side, they're sheltered for that time. And in the morning, they're proudly hand on
Absolutely.
the school to the students again, and so on. And this comes from an expert, because she, just makes enough to make a living, lives in social housing. It's a sad situation, but she's not demotivated. She's very optimistic and has these, and I love your term of your institute grassroots, right? Because she's one of these little grasses.
Grassroots Institute.
They come from the bottom
right.
up, as opposed to from top down, which is not coming, let's be honest
Well,
about
I love
that.
the fact that you say she's an expert. You see, she wouldn't be regarded as an expert in the world of public policy or government or the Department of Education or the Department of Housing. But she is expert because she lives in that nexus of being, of having and not having, of needing to make a living. But I love that concept that she came up with, which is symbiotic. Rather than seeing things or problems in isolation, homelessness over here, schools over here, why not see us as part of the same system and not at odds with each other, but as assets for each other, as you talked about the fact that the homeless could actually be the stewards for taking care of the property at night.
Exactly.
They can actually enhance the property. They can clean the property. They can
Yeah.
build on the property, do planting on the property, and so forth, as well as sleep there.
And that being said, going to the next step in the Rethinking Paradise model, if you have the streets from the cars, you can actually take out the asphalt that causes what we call the heat island effect, because it's concrete, it radiates and makes the city actually a couple degrees hotter than it usually is. And we replace it with trees again. The trees provide shading, so you can actually be comfortable again.
There we
and
go.
they could be fruit-bearing trees.
There we go.
And you basically could feed everyone, including the ones that we used to call homeless, and we are now calling them the stewards. And the tourists who would actually come and basically thinking, wow, that's this fruit I can only buy in the grocery store in the refrigerated compartment, and that actually grows here.
Well, that's very exciting to see tourists as well included in this symbiotic, integrative thinking. Martin, I want to thank you so much for being on our program today. I've been enlightened just by chatting with you. And
Pleasure
I hope
and
you've
honor
enjoyed
on
it.
my side. Thanks for having
Same
me.
here. My guest today has been Martin Despang, a professor of architecture at the University of Hawaii, originally from Germany. He's enlightening many students and many in the public policy world with ways of rethinking paradise. This is Kelii Akina at the Grassroots Institute for ThinkTech Hawaii. E hana kako. Let's work together. We'll see you next week, Monday at 2 o'clock. Aloha.